this video idea popped in my head. I wasn't going to initially do it since I did a lot of videos this week, but I figured I might as well touch upon the Dead Rising series with my own history, with my own experience, and sort of give some perspective about what I felt between each game and talk about my final thoughts on the Vancouver closing. So Dead Rising 1, I believe the first time I seen that game was a family member playing it on the Xbox 360. They brought it over our house and they started playing, setting up, and I was really intrigued by the concept, the RPG elements, and thousands upon thousands of zombies on screen. It was something that I never really seen in mass quantities before. Like Resident Evil, you might have the hallway where there's 6 or 7 zombies on the damn screen, but Dead Rising was chock full of areas like this, and it ran pretty normally in my opinion. I didn't know if there was frame rate problems or not back then, but I remember you could strike someone with a weapon and sometimes the game would freeze up. So Dead Rising 1 introduced Frank West. He is a photojournalist on a case about a city that is under turmoil. Willamette is under turmoil and he has to go in and investigate. Eventually shit gets fucked up and he has to jump on the rooftop of a mall, and I laughed so hard when that happened. And eventually he meets some mysterious characters along the way, and then you get to discover the conspiracy as you go along. As you go along, you discover that yes, this was a planned outbreak by certain people, and eventually I just love the idea of everything, man. The fact that you could pick up any type of weapon and strike any opponent with it, the fact that you could fight psychopaths and that was the game's bosses, and it was just a bunch of crazy people in this situation. Like, you might have a clown that went crazy, you might have a gun shop owner that went nuts, and you have to put them down. And there's some pretty sad stories behind some of these psychopaths. One thing that bothered me a lot about Dead Rising 1, and I think it might bother a lot of other people, is the escort system in that game. It's horrendously bad. I believe I got Saint, and I could tell you, having Saint on PS4, that achievement itself, that feels like an accomplishment. You have to escort 50 survivors back to the safe room without any error getting in the way, and it's very, very strenuous. The survivors really don't listen to what you say. I think what happens is they get caught on geometry, or they get caught on the zombies themselves, and they tend to take hits, and then they eventually die super fast. So it's a lot of managing how these situations will go, getting into the way of the zombies, trying to prevent the survivors from being killed. Dead Rising 2, it felt like a bit of an improvement because obviously they had combo weapons. Combo weapons were the game's, concept of going around and putting together two mismatched weapons. Like, you might put a electricity battery on top of a Blanca mask from Street Fighter, and it might have some very hilarious results. It felt bigger in scope this time around. I believe Dead Rising 2 was the start of the Western process with Dead Rising. Dead Rising 1 already felt like a Western game in my opinion. I mean, it has those influences of Dawn of the Dead with the mall, to the point where even I think Romero sued the Capcom developers and they had to put a big sticker on the box saying, Dead Rising is not trying to be like Dawn of the Dead, so please do not get that correlation mixed up. Anyway, I digress. I think to step things up in a certain category with the combo weapons, and the fact that you could have like more accessibility to vehicles. You have chainsaw bikes. I thought that stuff was pretty damn dope, dude. But 2 carried on the torch for a while. That was the story of Chuck Green in this new casino-like area, and I think the area is the main attraction in most Dead Rising games, and that really started to show. You could go and gamble, you could go and fight more psychopaths. I think it was also cool to see that Said Dweller's music was also put into Dead Rising 2. I've been a big fan of his for a long time, and that really drew some appeal to the game for me. I always liked the psychopath music, even in the first game, even in the second one. I don't remember too much about the third one in terms of music, but 2 was a nice experience. Like I said, that added the addition of co-op, and that extended the replay value even longer, and I believe Dead Rising needs that. If you're going to have a evolution of the Dead Rising series, you have to put in co-op now, bar none. So 2 wasn't quite finished with yet, and I think this was around the start of the Inafune westernization process, where they were trying to cater more to gamers and Western practices. I think Dead Rising 2 had DLC for the Xbox 360 exclusively. I believe Case West never came to PS3, despite Dead Rising 2 starting to have that multi-plat feeling to it, because it came to PS3, PC, and Xbox 360. And then I'm not going to talk about the remasters yet, but I never got the chance to play Case West and Case Zero. Those DLCs basically were before and after Dead Rising 2, so there's some plot elements going on that unfortunately people will miss if they didn't have the Xbox 360 version, and it never got ported to any of the remasters, which is quite disappointing. Then there was the Dead Rising 2 off the record scenario. Off the record was a what if scenario. What if Frank West took the place of the new character Chuck Green, and he was introduced into Dead Rising 2? Frank got fat. that was the funniest thing. Like, Frank Aykroyd got super fat, and they added a new area to the Dead Rising 2 map, which is the little circus carnival place that you could go to, Uranus Zone, and you could go in there and literally have a blast. I found Off the Record to be another solid experience, but I found it redundant at that point. Like, why would you need to reskin the entirety of Dead Rising 2 and create a entirely new game from it? Why couldn't that be DLC or something? I think maybe it had to do with the new area, because they obviously wanted to be a bit, I wouldn't say they were lazy. I just think they wanted to create that new area. They didn't want to go through the hassle of making it an update, and I believe that the Xbox 360 updates at the time only allowed a certain data cap to come through. So I don't even know if it would have been plausible to make this DLC if they wanted to have multi-platform in mind. Now, this DLC did feel like filler. Like I said, it's non-canon, it's what if. So I don't know what the goal was, other than let's get another Dead Rising game out there and let's put Frank West as the protagonist. That eventually became a tagline throughout the series, you know. Frank's missing in a certain game, Frank's missing here, let's shoehorn him in a certain game as the main character, because fans miss him and they might boost sales by buying a game with him in it, when that shouldn't even be a tagline to begin with, in my opinion. It was nice that you could play between Frank and Chuck online, and they had challenges now where you could do certain objectives, like maybe you could do something completely stupid and ridiculous, like carrying around dildos and putting them in a certain space, a certain corona, before time runs out. It's just that wacky, ridiculous fun that still remains prevalent, that you can't get too mad that Dead Rising 2 off the record still feels like filler, but it still feels like good old Dead Rising 2 fun, and that's why I sort of gave it a pass. But it is what it is. Capcom just put out a what if game, and they wanted to put Frank West on it in order for you to buy it. Then we fast forward to Dead Rising 3. I think Dead Rising 3 was being touted as a big deal because, well, obviously it was an Xbox One launch exclusive, but I didn't buy it later until it was on PC Steam. I played that game, and honestly, it seems like they were building the game up to be a sort of dark horror game. Like, you know, there was the lighting system where you saw Nick Ramos in a stall in a bathroom in a small house that was like super dark, and he was being attacked by zombies. Like, the zombies pop out of the stalls and off the record, and it felt like Dead Rising was going to add this bit of, you know, horror aesthetic, but they kept the traditional Dead Rising gameplay. From what I've seen, it just seems like it takes place in a small town now. You could drive around, you're free to go wherever you want, and a lot of people complain about the timer, but I think it's a lot more lax in Dead Rising 3 after playing it for so many hours. Dead Rising 3's main problem is that the game is way too oversimplified. It's too easy to do certain things. Even when I was fighting bosses, I didn't really feel challenged because I was able to get a powerful weapon like the Mega Buster and blow some of the bosses to Kingdom Come. I think really the weapon lockers was a bad idea. Also, you could store up like SARS and everything, and you could blow away the competition, so the game really felt way too easy. You couldn't do that in previous Dead Rising games. Your weapons would break, you couldn't really store everything on you if you're a lower level. If you were a lower level, you might have to drop weapons, etc. Now they're telling you you can store weapons in lockers and keep them infinitely, and that made it way too easy. So that's the game's only problem, but it's still a good game despite its faults, and I really loved it, man. I do. The co-op once again came back. They also had some Hyper EX edition DLC that was pretty ridiculous, but I never played like any of the character stories that they had as DLC. That was something a little bit different and altered as well, so when I get the chance, maybe I will check it out. I do have it on Steam, like I said, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the experience. I do think the story isn't as, you know, interesting as Dead Rising 1. I think eventually, as time went on, Nick Ramos feels less of a badass and more like fickle tissue paper in certain scenes. Like, I'm telling you the truth, he feels like he gets talked down to a lot. So I didn't get to any badass moments yet, but that's how I feel right now after my initial playthrough. Then we move on to the stint. No Dead Rising news, nothing for a long time, and then we get to Dead Rising 4. This game had controversy out the ass for a good reason. Frank was going back to Willamette. It seemed like a great idea at first. It was a Christmas setting. It felt like it was going back to roots. But that's not what we got. What we got instead was a bunch of EA hipsters coming into the fray and fucking up this game, and this is where Capcom Vancouver made the wrong choice. So far, DR1, 2, even off the record, and 3, they have been pretty solid titles, but 4 is where the nail was put in the coffin. It was very apparent that the writing was on the wall when you thought about Dead Rising 4, and it was smeared in shit. These developers had no idea what they were doing here, and I think it really showed with that game. Every interview, and I think the popular example is the Kroby Cat coverage of Dead Rising 4. Every interview felt like terminal cancer on your nuts. They were taking things out. They were regressing the series heavily, and it really showed with Dead Rising 4. No mixing, no food, no TJ Rotolo as Frank West, no story co-op, all of these things, no escorting survivors back to the safe room after a long journey, the maniacs replacing psychopaths and not being that dynamic or interesting with intros or outros telling their flawed story, and of course no options for time limit. They just removed that entirely. That made Dead Rising feel a lot more tense. I know a lot of people, they could do without the time limit, but it would be pretty cool to have that as a challenge, and I enjoyed when the option was there. Dead Rising 4 took much more away. They took away everything that made Dead Rising fun, and they left some lifeless husk that is playable, but it is not enjoyable overall as a Dead Rising game. And then there is the problem that they had with the Frank Rising DLC, which I thought was stupid because they were selling you the true ending as DLC. Again, this is where I can't defend Capcom here. That was fucking terrible. Why would you do something like that? It only gets worse from here. While the game ended on an anticlimax, they had Frank turn into a zombie where it gets super repetitive. All you're doing is leaping on enemies and taking them out. Even Stubbs the zombie had more options than this shit, right? And then they reversed the zombification process, so a canon Dead Rising game breaks canon. Unbelievable. Unfucking believable. That's never been done before until Dead Rising 4 Frank Rising. I swear. So now the series is in limbo, and what happened recently is that Capcom Vancouver, they recently shuttered. They closed down. I made a video on this reporting this, but I think the line was in the sand. I think we knew they crossed that point of no return. Dead Rising 4 hit them hard, and they also did a game called Pocket Fighter for the Androids, a Street Fighter sort of puzzle fighter game. I believe they did this before. I think Street Fighter had this super puzzle game on the Saturn or something, I don't remember, but yeah, they had a puzzle fighter before, and they tried to revive it for mobile phone users. Well, too bad, because that game died in the womb. And I'm not even going to go into the deplorable writing behind Frank West's character in Dead Rising 4. He is a one-liner spouting joke with no originality to his character. He doesn't have any sort of depth in Dead Rising 4. Now, granted, I'm not going to pretend that Frank West is a multi-layered, intricate character. He's not. He's not the most complex character in the world, but he's still a character in Dead Rising 1. In Dead Rising 4, he's a walking punchline with jokes that really doesn't land. He feels like a watered down, stupid Deadpool in Dead Rising 4. I was so disappointed with that game. I was so done. And like I said, Capcom Vancouver, they shuttered. I don't think that they were going to recover after 4 and after Pocket Fighter went the way of the dodo. And then a lot of people are saying, you know, Capcom Vancouver deserved it. I think they could have done a better job. They could have done way better than what we got with Dead Rising 4. They should have put more quality control into that product, and maybe, just maybe, if they didn't make all those bad decisions, they would still be around today, which is quite disappointing to see them go. Again, they made very, very prominent Dead Rising titles that felt consistent. I don't know what's going to happen next when Japan covers the series, or if they go back to the series at all. But I will say positivity is there, because if Japan covers Dead Rising, if the Japanese Capcom studio goes back and really explores that series in a new light, then they could create something fantastic, because Dead Rising 1 was made by a Japanese in-house studio before Blue Castle got their hands on Dead Rising with Dead Rising 2. I have high hopes if Capcom still remembers that IP, but again, it might be put to dormancy right now until they figure out what they're going to do after Blue Castle shut down, after Capcom Vancouver got shuttered. The last thing I want to talk about is the general reception to Dead Rising. The sales are pretty meh, you know. I think Dead Rising 1 barely scraped like 1 million copies, so it's not a prolific Capcom seller. If you look on Capcom's platinum list, I'm pretty sure it's on there, but it's not like in the top 10s probably. It's not like a super smash hit in terms of sales. I think that Dead Rising sold enough to get by. I think that it is generally received as a C-tier series. Not a lot of people seem to know about it, but the people who have played Dead Rising, they really did enjoy those games. But I don't think they had a Dead Rising game that hit critical acclaim. The series never peaked like Resident Evil did with Resident Evil 4, where they had a smash Game of the Year contender, 50 Game of the Year awards going back and forth. It's not a mass seller like Monster Hunter World, where that game sold way too much for its own merit, and I love that game and I think it deserves it, but it sold a lot to be Capcom's number one, and I think Capcom probably didn't even expect that to happen. So I don't think that Dead Rising reached that peak yet. It could be possible. Maybe we could get a Dead Rising game that reaches that mass stardom, and Capcom might be able to be incentivized to make more sequels. You never know. You just never know. Anyway, this video has gone on for way too long. I hope you guys enjoyed my memories of the Dead Rising series. I thought that 1 through 3 was great, but I thought that Dead Rising 4 was a disappointment. I also thought that Dead Rising 3 was a bit too easy, and if they ever have Dead Rising 5, they need to go back to the drawing board and find out what worked and what doesn't.